All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the school. We're in a new calendar year, but not new school year. But hopefully, everyone has made it back in to session. And so for January's Brunch and Learn, we have a real treat for you. I'm excited about this. So we're going to be talking about the science GED subtest. And so today we're looking at making those connections, GED science activities for face-to-face and online instruction. And again, my name is Rebecca Hannon, and I'm out of Aiken County, and I serve as one of the curriculum specialists with the State Department. And today, Miss Jennifer is going to lead the way and give us some awesome tips and activities to help us get our students past the science tests. So Jennifer, I'll throw it to you.
All right. Yeah. Happy New Year, everybody. So as we think about the GED science test, a lot of us tend to think of that as kind of one of our go-tos. That, it's a little bit shorter than the other tests or whatnot. But there's definitely some students that can get held up, either because they just don't have enough background knowledge, or they don't have the math skills, or their reading skills just aren't up to par. So what I wanted to do today was to talk a little bit about the GED science test and the material that's covered on it, and then look at some activities that can be used whether you're in a face-to-face setting or whether you're in an online or virtual setting that involves very, very minimal equipment and pre-made preparation for you. So as we think about the test itself, obviously the actual test, 95 minutes, approximately. GED Ready test, 45 minutes, using very similar formats of questions to other subtests with, primarily multiple choice, drag and drop, those hotspot questions, and then some of those fill in the blank questions. And just an FYI there, if they're filling in the blank with a word that is already on the screen, then spelling does count. If the word is not already on the screen, then I guess they're just, as long as it's, something that they can figure out. But I got to watch out for that there. So as we think about the content that's covered on the science test, there are three basic areas of science: life science, which is like human body type stuff and cell type stuff and carrying capacities and all that good stuff. There's physical science, which has to do with, that basic chemistry and that basic physics type concepts. And then earth and space science that, gets us everywhere from tectonic plates to the universe. And within all three of those, they fall into what GED calls two focusing themes. Questions are either going to be regarding human health and living systems, or they're going to be regarding energy and related systems. And so this is a handy little chart that comes straight out of the assessment guide from GED that just kind of shows the various subtopics that could fall into those particular themes. Looking in more detail, half of the questions approximately are going to give you a stimulus. So a graph, a passage, a diagram, something of that nature, and they give you 2 to 3 items that involve using that. Whereas then the other half of the questions are going to tend to be standalone items. So, helping students with that test taking strategy of spending a little bit more time maybe studying the passage or studying the graph at the beginning might be something that you want to talk to your students about, given the fact that there's likely to be, you got a 50-50 chance of it involving more than one question to prepare for. And approximately 60% of the test is going to be at that DOK level 2, that skill concept level. So asking them to infer or to interpret or to use their context clues or summarize. So that second level of knowledge there. There's a good chunk of questions that could potentially be at level 1, that recall. And there's a good chunk of questions that could potentially be at level 3. That's more strategic thinking, but nothing on the GED science test is going to hit that level for extended thinking. So science test items are aligned with a science practice, one of them, and a science topic, one of them. So a science practice, that's referring to the skills that are necessary for scientific reasoning. A content topic is the science content topic itself, health science, ecosystems, whatever it may be. So you're going to have one skill being tested and one piece of content area knowledge being tested. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like in a minute. When you're reviewing students' GED ready score reports, note that they're going to list science practices and they're not going to list the content topics. So bear in mind that, you're not really able to make any, generalizations or draw any conclusions about what content knowledge they know based on that score report alone. And so these are just some of these science practices. These are these skills. A lot of them have overlap with the reading test, and some of them have overlap with the math test as well. But this is, finding evidence to support a conclusion, or reasoning from data, or, using those graphs, our favorite counting, and combinations and permutations and probability. So these aren't particular content topics, but these are skills. And so each question is going to involve one of these skills. GED claims that it is only one science practice and only one content area for each question. So when it comes to the content knowledge, when you look at, the standards or the indicators for GED science, it can be a little bit overwhelming, all of the potential topics and subtopics on there. But according to the GED assessment guide, this is a direct quote, the level of content knowledge should be broadly and generally familiar. Love that. So what it means is folks need to be able to recognize and understand the terms, but they don't need to, know things super in depth. For instance, they need to know what a chemical equation is. And it's like, oh, it's got these two, on the left side, these are the things that are being put together. And on the right side, this is what's being made. They don't necessarily have to be able to do some sort of crazy balancing chemical equations kind of thing. The stimuli or stimulus, depending on how many you have, are going to give you those details, with the graphics or the formulas or the key principles. So those graphs, those diagrams, those passages are going to give all of those necessary details. And then the stimuli and the answer choices can use specific subtopic terms, but they're never going to ask the test taker to come up with a definition of those. It's going to be something that they can pull from the given information. So don't need to freak out about all the various topics we're going to talk about. We just want that familiarity with them. And so that familiarity is going to lead us to be able to do textual analysis, to test understanding, to know how to represent data and understand representations of data, everyone's favorite inference skills, and problem solving using both academic and workplace contexts. So looking specifically at some kind of units that you can use or lessons that you can use, the first few of these are more directly related to the science practice skills themselves. And then they kind of move more into topical focuses. With a lot of these science practices, they are definitely worth introducing on their own outside of the content knowledge and then mixing them in there, particularly when it comes to, things like probability questions. So an investigations unit, that's going to be hidden practices involving the scientific method, hypotheses, identifying them, writing stronger ones, all of those, recognizing independent and dependent variables, whether it's, in a text or a chart or a graph, and then being able to evaluate conclusions based on data or on written out text. Another practice unit that's important would have to do with data. So this is going to have to do with using and answering questions and analyzing tables and diagrams and about 1,000 different types of graphs and charts. obviously, folks, won't need to be like, oh, that's a double line graph. It's not going to ask you what's the name of this graph. It's not doing things like that. It's asking you to answer questions based on any number of these. Of course, just like the social studies test, mean, median, mode, and range are fair game. Some sources of science information do not mention range. Some of them do. I think that it's worth covering just because it's only going to take you 2 seconds, and they have to use it on other tests. This is a good place to introduce using formulas. The GED science test can give folks a formula and then basically ask them to do a little mini algebra problem. And so you might see this with calculating force or changing temperatures from Celsius to Fahrenheit. They're never going to ask the student to come up with the formula. They're always going to give them the formula and enough information needed to solve it. And of course, when they're answering any questions like that, they're always going to have access to the TI-30XS calculator. And then a little bit regarding sampling techniques, making sure they understand that vocabulary about, sample versus population, and what types of samples, is a bigger sample always better, is random sampling. And so it doesn't go too terribly in the weeds, but definitely some techniques, or some basic concepts that they need to have so that they can answer questions, particularly when it comes to how experiments can be improved based on sampling techniques. Also, over on the practices side of things, counting techniques. So, using that fundamental counting principle, you've got 3 kinds of meat and 2 kinds of cheese and 4 kinds of bread. How many different sandwiches can you have? Assuming nothing's spoiled. And then, of course, permutations and combinations. This is the same as they're running into on the GED math test. And the big thing to emphasize here, of course, is that they're not necessarily going to identify this is a permutation, this is a combination in that question. So making sure that your students understand which one is which and which process to use for which. Important thing to emphasize. Can be difficult for folks, but worth it because it's going to show up on 2 tests. Also on the 2 test end of things, probability. Simple probability problems, compound probability problems. And then it seems that there's more on the independent event side than the dependent event side. But again, it's not a bad idea to talk about finding, probability of dependent events, because if it doesn't show up here, it is going to show up on that math test. So we've kind of looked at covering the basics of the science practices. These are more on the content topic side of things. So this is just a suggested way that you could potentially group these into units. Doesn't cover everything possible, but it's going to get enough of the meat of it so that they're familiar. So life science, a general life science unit, could be looking at cells and mitosis and meiosis. They're not going to have to spit out what's phase 4, but making sure that they understand basically what those are doing, recognizing food chains and those producer and consumer and decomposer relationships, or predator-prey relationships. And then, we all keep hearing about carrying capacities somehow coming up, and then, those natural resources as well. So just making sure you have a good familiarity with those types of things. A health science unit could be super useful, covering the human body systems, and then also kind of getting a little bit into nutrients or homeostasis or transmission of diseases can also be useful. And this is a good time to mention, you don't necessarily have to cover everything when you're doing your instruction prior to these activities that we're going to be talking about here in a little bit, but you want to make sure that they have their feet wet enough in a topic so that then they could answer questions or do activities involving a smaller, subtopic or a smaller item of that. Genetics. Obviously, this is, a part of the health science and life science, but we want to make sure that they understand those genotypes and phenotypes and all that good stuff, and what's dominant, what's recessive, and then making sure that they're prepared for those Punnett squares, not just the single ones, but the double ones as well that seem to be more common. On the basic chemistry side of things, recognizing, what state of matter is something in and how changes of state are happening, being able to discern physical versus chemical properties and reactions, and then, chemical equations, and how those relate over to law of conservation of mass. Don't have to go deep, but you just want to make sure that if they were to see a question that had to do with changes in state, it wouldn't be something that was completely new to them. And then on the physics side of things, spend plenty of time with our good friend Isaac Newton. These physics type areas are definitely places that science practice of using formula could absolutely be coming in. And of course, the calculator is going to be available there. And then finally, spending a little bit of time on Earth and space science, which ranges, anywhere from, tectonic plates on the quote unquote local end, all the way up to understanding, what does it mean when they say universe, and literally everything in between. So what I want to get into now is some sample activities. These activities are, like I said earlier, ones that you can use in a face-to-face setting, or ones that you could use in an online or a virtual setting as well. And they generally don't require any more than a piece of paper. So not a ton of prep that has to be done on these. There is a link. It is in Brightspace, and it is at the end of this, where it takes you to a PowerPoint that's just these, in case you just wanted to pop them up to do them with your students. So we have one sample activity for each of those big areas that we just talked through. So once you've talked through with your students a little bit about investigations and those scientific method related science practices, then you could do an activity involving experimental thinking. So it could start out, this activity kind of involves looking at steps that a scientist did for a particular experiment, and then figuring out how to put them in order of what would have happened with the scientist following the scientific method. So this is making sure that they understand that logical progression before they get into the second part, which involves analyzing an experiment. So giving them an experiment and then asking them to respond to a few questions that are meant to make sure that they understand a hypothesis, that are meant to make sure that they understand how a hypothesis is tested through an experiment, to recognize those independent and dependent variables, and then to try to, look at making conclusions and do I agree with the conclusion that they made, all of those things. So looking at analyze an experiment, and then going into actually designing a basic experiment themselves. Obviously, the GED test doesn't include the section that actually has them, design an experiment flat out, but there's still few ways that are better to make sure that somebody understands the scientific method and understands how experiments work than to have them actually come up with one themselves. So they got to come up with their own hypothesis. They've got to come up with how they would test that, what the independent and dependent and controlled variables be, and what data is going to be collected. So actually thinking through their own to really create that knowledge within themselves. Over on the data side of things, so this is where we were talking about graphs and mean, median, and mode, formulas, all of that. You could potentially give a data set. This one's called Let Us See. I got to have my puns. And so this gives a data set about a new container for holding lettuce, and the amount of time that various trials went without mold versus the old container, the current container that they're using. So this is having them use those mean, median, and mode skills and figuring out what they really mean, not only calculating the numbers, but what does that mean in terms of helping me to draw an actual conclusion. On the counting techniques, this one can be a little bit tricky, and it can also be a little bit frustrating for some students, but doing anything that you can to, address it from maybe a brain teasers kind of angle. So giving them a list and then letting them choose and talk through or get with a partner or something like that. So, I like to avoid looking at them as problems, and I like to look at them more as a brain teaser, because it tends to put people in a little bit more positive of a mindset when it comes to problems that can be challenging for some learners, especially if this is like the first test that they're taking and they haven't gotten very far into ED math yet. On the probability side of things, this is a neat new activity called Remove One. And so basically what the students are doing, they're numbering a piece of paper from 1 to 12. And then they've got 15 dots that they can put beside any of the numbers that they want to. And so then you as the teacher are rolling the dice. And if the sum that's shown on the dice matches one of their dots, they cross it off. And the first person to cross off all of their dots wins. And so they play it once, and then they kind of talk about their experiences, like, oh, well, it seemed like this number came up a lot more than that number. You see where we're going with this, of course. And then, once you've had just enough of a conversation, letting them play one more time and seeing how much faster it is. And so from there, you can get into a lot of good conversations about, higher probability or lower probability. You could even get into a little bit of that experimental versus theoretical probability, if that made sense for your learners. But it's just kind of a good object lesson that you can jump off and go wherever from. It's also a good one if you have enough students that are nerds and like Settlers of Catan. It'll, totally reinvigorate how they play that game. Over on life science. Now, again, we talked about you can't cover everything. So perhaps picking an activity that does one, like this food chains activity. So it's giving them a diagram of a particular food chain, and then they're identifying who is who. Obviously, you've already introduced this content before you went to that. And then having them come up with 3 potential food chains that could come out of this web. So it's having them interact with that diagram. There's our science practice. And then apply that content knowledge to it. On the life science side of things, bingo. So having them create a bingo card, or you could create them if you had everyone face to face. And then it's their job to create their card by putting the name of a system in each square, and they use each one of them twice. And then you have the questions already here ready to go. You use as many as you needed to. And so it'd be something like, the tongue mashes food as a part of this system. And so they'd mark digestive. And in these questions, it always mentions, like, if the problem was talking about a particular body part, obviously the answer is going to be the system, but it mentions what that body part is in case you're trying to do hints or something like that. So these are just some sample questions that you could use to kind of make sure that they're, understanding, how these things are categorized and their functions and all of that. You're not going to be able to hit everything involving health science, but this is a good way to get a good idea of a good chunk of things that could potentially be showing up. The never to be forgotten genetics part of life science and the genetic lottery. So this one is super fun. It's a designer baby. So the students decide what traits the first parent has and what traits the second parent has, and then what they're hoping that child would have. So, and then at that point, they've got 4 different Punnett squares to do for 4 different traits. And so they're finding the probability of having each particular trait that they wanted, that single Punnett square. And then at the end, the probability of getting all of the traits that they want, which is teaching them how to do a double, or in this case, quadruple Punnett square, and touching on those probability concepts that we had looked at before in the practices. So hopefully you're kind of starting to see how these things partner together. So that can be a lot of fun, especially when they come up with something that they want the kid to have, and then they realize that it's not possible based on the parents that they chose. So super fun. Chemistry. Obviously, there's a lot more that you can do if you're face-to-face. And you have the ability to do, little experiments or things like that. That doesn't work in every setting, and it certainly doesn't work in an online setting necessarily. So you can more use identifying type thing. So traits versus behaviors, meaning, is this a physical property or is this a chemical property? And then, perhaps, once you went through and identified, Maybe you have them come up with some of their own for each category to make sure that they understand the difference. It's the answer key provided for you. And then different versus new. Is it a physical reaction or is it a chemical reaction? And these, of course, all lead into that conversation about that law of conservation of mass, so that, you know, you can hit that one there as well. So even if you can't show all of these things, you can certainly have some really good conversations here and get some really good life connections going in there as well with folks, you know, lived experiences. On the physics side, we have Mr. Isaac Newton and his TED Talk on vehicle safety. So you'll have looked at force and Newton's laws, and then you can take a look at this diagram of a car and how these various parts of the car are involved with safety features like anti-lock brakes or how the windshield is designed to shatter. And so once you've gotten to kind of look at this together, and again, you know, there's a lot of real world connections that folks can be making here, then it's, well, what would Newton be saying in his TED Talk? So why would Newton say that it's important to wear a seatbelt? And so you're getting to connect to those Newton's laws there. And people could even come up with additional questions as well, but just kind of, you know, a way to make sure that we're applying those things, but it doesn't seem so out there, random. Why do I need to know this physics crap? Well, because you need to understand riding in a vehicle and why you need to put a seatbelt on yourself and your kids and all that good stuff. So that can be a fun way to do that. And then Earth and space science, this is a good one, particularly for including science practices and getting a lot of those math side of skills in there. So this one, the math isn't terribly hard on part one, but it does involve them figuring out how to do this. And I would suggest not giving them too much information in the beginning, unless they end up needing that support. So we've got these various destinations, and then how far those are from the sun. And for the record, using kilometers, the numbers are a lot cleaner, but this activity uses miles because that's going to be more meaningful to our students. But it's certainly, you know, a good place to have a conversation about, you know, science is usually using the metric system, etc. So it gives, anyways, it gives the distance from the sun. And then from there, you've got to figure out how far it is from Earth. And obviously the trick is recognizing how far Earth is from the sun and then, you know, subtracting from there in either direction to get those distances. And there's an answer key. Don't worry, you don't have to do all that math. And these numbers are all rounded. In general, they are rounded up regardless of what. But, you know, again, you can get a little bit of variety there just based on what you want to explain. So they get these figured out. They run these math problems. They're using their calculator, making sure they understand all that. And then the next piece is figuring out the travel time. So you've got the various destinations, how far they are from Earth, which the students have already figured out. And then if you were using a rocket today, so rockets today are going about 17,000 miles an hour. So if you're in a rocket, how long is it going to take you to get to Mercury? But if you're going at warp speed, which is, of course, the Star Trek name for speed of light, that's 671 million miles an hour. So figuring out what that would be. So there, you know, it's involving those unit rates, you know, it's involving, you know, all of those different little math concepts there. And then, of course, there's the answers. And then there could be some neat conversations that come out of here as well. You know, you can get anywhere in the solar system in under 6 hours if you're moving at warp speed. So a lot of interesting conversations and things like that. And that can help them with a lot of different understandings about the setup of the solar system and even some cool conversations about, you know, where technology is going and things of that nature. Before we wrap, Rebecca, I feel like I have talked a whole bunch. Is there anything you'd like to throw in?
No, I love these activities. I'll tell you, science has proven to be a bit of a challenge over the past year. So seeing what's on the test, to me, the most eye-opening thing was the content that's tested, but then really having to address those skills. I can see through your presentation here, there's I don't know. There was a disconnect for me. So I appreciate what you've explained here, and I can't wait. Bingo is the one I'm super excited about trying.
Yes.
So I love it. These are fun activities. And so I think you've done an awesome job here, and I can't wait to jump in and try these things out. So
very cool. So, and everyone is perfectly set up to do that. This QR code here, if I don't know that that's necessarily useful in this format, but this is going to take you to, and we'll link this in Brightspace as well, a PowerPoint that basically just has those activities so that theoretically you could just pop it right up on your smart board or share it on your screen or whatever. And then, from there, you could also make a copy of it if you wanted to make your own changes, which I would strongly suggest that you do to make it work for your learners. This PowerPoint as well is going to be available in Brightspace. And then the big source for the GED science test, and there's of course these for the other subjects as well, but the science assessment guide, if you really sit down and read it, there's a lot that you can get from there and a lot of really great little tidbits. So if you have a bunch of students that are working on science right now, or can't understand why everyone's stuck at that 144, whatever it may be, the tip that you need is probably sitting in that assessment guide. It's a really, really fantastic resource. So I hope that some of this information about the test, hopefully there was something you could pick up there. And then hopefully one or two of these activities will be something that's meaningful for your learners and helps them just to get a little bit different of a way to make those connections, not only between the practices and the content topics, but between their life and the GED science content. Because if we can make those connections, we know that we're in business. Thank you, guys.
yes, thank you so much, Jennifer. So guys, this is going to be uploaded, all these documents, as Jennifer said, in Brightspace. So you will see this after you watch this recording. Jump on down to the resource tab under the January tab that you're already in watching this, and check out those resources. Please share some feedback. As always, after you complete this webinar and you complete looking at the resources, please do that monthly survey that's also attached to get you your credit for viewing this Brunch and Learn. It'll also give us the feedback to kind of see which direction to go next, see what other feedback we can help with. And then, of course, be on the lookout for February. We're going to do very similar here, like Jennifer has done here with science. We're going to look at the social studies, though. So we're going to give social studies a little love next month. So thank you all for watching, and have a great week.